And
Yeah.
so I always kind of saw, these types of things as intuitive gifts, seeing spirits is a really scary kind of thing. And so,
Yeah.
from my abuse and between all of that, I actually, started struggling with drug addiction at a very young age, like starting around 14 or so is when it began. And,
Mhm.
as, we as women know, right, kind of the whole thing of like, oh, when your sexuality or something's taken from you very young and you didn't have power over it, you
Yeah.
kind of, either form a certain type of disconnect from the body in one way, that there maybe some women shut down, some become hypersexual. And I kind of took, that hypersexuality route. And
Right.
so for in actuality, the longest time, when I was around still in high school, I remember I began working, as a stripper in a strip club. At that time, I, was already pretty heavily into using certain types of drugs and things. And my intuitive gifts kind of took a dull at that time. And as I got older, though, into, my 20s, all of a sudden they started to emerge much stronger. And I remember at that time,
Mm.
I'm very open. I was at the time working, as, an escort. I'd worked within the sex industries. I'd worked for Playboy, Penthouse, all these different things. My whole life, basically, and all of my income revolved around my sexuality, because that was something that, I don't know, I just always was just like, okay, well, this is just what works. And also, my previous experiences. But around my 20s, it was, I started experiencing similar things that Jasmine's described, right? Where
Mhm.
I became aware of kind of my sexual power, but almost in a very different way than,
Yeah.
like, okay, yeah, men are attracted to you, sexy to whatever, but in the actual like energetic sense, right? And
Right.
I remember being like, okay, I would feel extremely drained, or like, when I'd have sexual exchanges, certain things, or that, you would attract these energies and people would become, addicted, or in a certain sense. And so
Yeah. No, literally addicted. Like, that's the right
and I
word.
remember being like, okay, this is strange. What's going on? And at that same time, in my late 20s, I would also have, and I know this is a long explanation, but I would also have like
No,
random
it's awesome.
psychics. I get stopped on the street. I'd had the crazy experiences where like psychics and people like, I remember one woman like leaving her grocery bags at the entrance of Ralph's in LA and sprinting
Yeah.
over to me in the parking lot and giving me kind of this whole prophecy about like how my life was going to change, and I needed to awaken my gifts and all these things. And at the time, I was still
Wow.
a drug user. I was still in these industries, and I was just kind of like, yeah, I know I've seen similar things. I'm not ready to deal with that. And over the course of the next, several years, this happened probably about like 10 other times in Las Vegas and San Francisco. Like all different people like would give me
Wow.
the same exact prophecy. And at that point, I still wasn't ready to deal with my gifts, or any of these kind of things that I've been being told. But
Yeah.
it wasn't really a choice. My energy started to kind of grow and expand and happen in such a way that I could not function in day-to-day life, meaning that
Yeah.
going out
I
in
completely
public, I
resonate.
could hear people's thoughts, I could sense
Wow.
feelings. I remember, I would get very upset because if I remember being in line at a grocery store, and a little girl that was like 8 years old, and just I was sensing a weird energy between her and whoever her male guardian was, and then seeing all these visions, hearing all these things about the things that this person was doing to her, right? And these types of things were common. And I couldn't shut it off. And at this time as well, the whole spirit thing started happening more and more, meaning that everywhere I would go, and I lived in LA, which is a crazy
Yeah.
place, I would see spirits, they would talk to me, ask me for help, all these things. And sometimes there were ones, again, that were like in childhood that were very harassing. And I remember
Mm.
then, I was working with a Reiki master. I would receive energy work, and I had no interest
Mhm.
in, say, that work at the time. But I started to notice that there would be periods that if somebody needed healing, like my entire body would heat up, my hands would heat up, and I could feel what felt like Reiki energy, or just, you know, a really intense energy throughout my entire body. And sometimes
Mm.
being kind of my being, it felt like against my own free will to just go wherever it needed. So at that time, I basically realized like, okay, you know what? I need to find a teacher. I need to find teachers training or something to deal with this, right? Like I need to know how to harness these gifts, because this is now getting in the way of my normal life. I don't want to go in public places. I don't, it was just very
Yeah.
overwhelming, right? I was like a sponge soaking up people's energy. I could go in a bathroom.
Yes.
If a woman was on her period, I would all of a sudden have debilitating menstrual cramps, whatever,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And in particular with women, it was very strong. If I was around a
Yeah.
girlfriend, I'd be like, are you getting a headache or what's going on? Or does your stomach hurt? Because all of a sudden mine does. And so that's how I kind of started to really explore and go, okay, I'm going to start to harness my gifts. And I found
Mhm.
out, my late teens that there were other women in my family, primarily my father's side, that also had intuitive gifts. And I grew up predominantly around my mother's side of the family for the most part. So I wasn't familiar with them, right? I was always kind of the black sheep there. I was always loud, very like to dress sexy, wear makeup, be very
Yeah.
non-conservative. And then when I met
Mhm.
my father's side of the family, they were all like me. And I was like, oh, this is where, this is where I come from. They're loud, they're a little inappropriate, they're a bit out there, right? And they were the ones, and it's interesting because I still have aunties now that I'll post some crazy posts on Facebook, that like my great aunties, these women in their 70s will be like, oh, my sexy niece, like I'm so proud of you, right? And like people will judge you and go, oh, what does your family think about you posting pictures like this? Man, it's like, well, actually, if you go out there, you'll see like my 60, 70-year-old aunties up there, and they're the ones showing the most love, right? And so
Yes.
interesting in American
Awesome.
culture, right? Because here it's like, people act a certain way, but then I'm like, well, culturally, they're from a certain part of the Philippines, which where, the Spanish first came, and they have very different outlook. They also have a lot
Oh.
of those shamanic ties and carry that still within the DNA, because it's just like any trait,
Oh.
right? It gets
Yes.
passed in the bloodline. My mother's mother also could see spirits, but none of my family members ever really refined, say, their gifts or took it to a different level. And it was around my late 20s that I finally was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And I started working with a psychic first who was a shaman, and he taught me certain things, but he basically said there's a woman that's going to come into your life, and she'll take you to kind of that next level. She'll teach you to connect,
Mm.
to God, source, spirit, that consciousness directly, and in a way that it'll help you to develop yourself, he said, I remember, beyond what I can even do. And
Wow.
he was right. Right around the time that we're getting to the point that he could no longer help me, he was kind of gave me a warning, like, hey, I know you make really good money doing what you do, and like you still have your looks, you still have whatever, but like you're not meant to be in this much longer. Like you can't, your life's going to transition, you're not going to have a choice. So I basically suggest you prepare. You've got like 6 more months.
Wow.
And I remember going into a deep state of meditation at the time and going, okay, show me what's the truth. What do I need to know? And, I call it kind of like an initiation. I remember I was in this huge, empty, like big, but it was like almost reminded me of like a coliseum, but it was just very big white, like space, like, almost infinitely expanding. And all of those, what they refer to as, ascended masters, and a lot of those people, those types of figures and beings, whatever you may call them, were present. And I remember seeing
Wow.
myself, because we're going to go deep, like you said,
Yes, we're
like,
gonna go deep, celestial level.
right? Like looking and seeing like this huge book that I just intuitively knew this was like my book of soul contracts. And I remember seeing like
Wow.
a, a version of me, but like in this long white dress, and I'm signing something. And I remember going, kind of freaking out, going, okay, what am I doing in there? Because I know that's a soul contract. What am I signing up for? And
Wow.
I'm freaking out.